Hello, good evening, and welcome to another edition of Tanya Online, as we like to call it these days. Just adjust the camera. Okay, hopefully you can hear me and see me. Let's just make sure that we have everybody here. Okay. So, first of all, happy Hanukkah. It's a wonderful holiday. This is our second Tanya class on Hanukkah. So it's exciting. Thank you again for joining us. And we're going to jump right into it with a brief recap on last week's class, just to make sure that everybody's caught up. And then we'll jump right into today's topic. So last week, we really recapped a lot of chapters. Chapters that we've studied in person over the course of approximately 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years. And in a nutshell, the topic we covered last week is the essential the central theme of the Tanya. And that is that every Jew has a neshama. Every Jew has a soul. Every Jew has what the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, calls ahava mesuteres in Hebrew, the hidden love, the soul, which is a spark, a part of godliness, the essence, part of godliness inside every single individual. And it is with this that the Alter Rebbe says, every single Jew is close with God. God is close to every single Jew. And the Torah, the observance of mitzvahs, and following the mitzvahs, the traditions, and the guidelines that the Torah sets out for us is not only a path to happiness, to joy, and to leading a fulfilled life, but it is also easy to follow the Torah. And the basic premise the Alter Rebbe puts out for us is that a person doesn't have to change themselves. And this is one of the fascinating ideas of the Tanya, is that essentially a person doesn't need to change, that we already are what we need to be. And all the resources that we need are already contained within us. We don't need to change ourselves. We don't need to become something else, something different. We already are, and we already have everything that we need. The question is, can we tap into it? Can we make that a reality? So this is what we discussed in a little more detail last week, which is really a recap of many, many chapters, is that this, again, Hebrew term called ahava mesuteres, the hidden love. The hidden love essentially refers to the soul, the neshama that is contained within every single individual. And as we described last week, love, what is love, and how we define love, and the fact that the comparison that we make to different relationships that we have in our lives. And those relationships, actually, according to Kabbalah, those relationships exist in order so that we have a metaphor, so that we can understand the relationship that we have with God. It's a very powerful thing because our lives, the way we live them, we think it's kind of just independent. This is our life. This is how we live. And it's just kind of in a vacuum. This is how we live. The ideas of Chassidus is that the Chassidus says everything in our life is really a metaphor for something much greater, much bigger. And it is how we live in our lives, our physical, materialistic lives, that then resembles and represents the grander, larger picture out there. So the relationships that we have with the people that we're close with is a metaphor for the relationship we have with God, with the Almighty, with Hashem. And we gave an example of parents and children. The love between parents and children exists all the time. However, it's not constantly seen. I mean, parents love their children passionately, but the passion that a parent has for their child isn't seen on the parent at all hours of the day and night. You walk over and you see an individual, we don't even know if that person is a parent or not until we get to know that person and we find out, okay, they're a parent. And when you find out they're a parent and you say, hey, where's your passion for your child? Well, you can't see my passion for my child all the time. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Essentially, this idea is what the Alter Rebbe points out. Every Jew has a very, very deep, passionate love and connection to God. Every Jew, without compromise. And it is every individual, regardless of their background, regardless of their upbringing. The Alter Rebbe then questions, how can we use that? I mean, if I'm in love with someone or something, but I'm not aware of that love, what's it to me then? In that case, it's kind of useless. So the Alter Rebbe says what Moses told us in the Torah, that the words Ki karov elecha hadavar me'od, that the words of the Torah are extremely and exceedingly close to every single individual. That refers to this hidden love that every single Jew has to God. So the Alter Rebbe says, and this is kind of going to be the continuation of our topic today, the way we can make the words of the Torah close to us, the way we can make it easy, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, easy for us to fulfill the Torah. Because usually when we approach the Torah and mitzvahs, I shouldn't say perhaps usually, because it depends who, but many times, let's say, many times it's difficult to fulfill all of the mitzvahs. It's difficult to do every single thing perfectly, or at least try to do it perfectly. We all have our lazy spells or our difficult times. The Alter Rebbe says it's easy for every individual to always live a life where I feel this passionate connection to God, and therefore that inspires me and motivates me to action, to do something about that love. And again, in the metaphor, just like if I have a passionate relationship, and if that's a parent and a child, at a moment where I feel very close to my children, I want to do something to show that love. It expresses itself in some sort of action to display that relationship that exists, that powerful relationship that exists. So it's not out there all the time, as we said, but when it does come to the forefront, I want to express it in some sort of action. The Alter Rebbe then says, a Jew can use that love that already exists within them, can use that to express their love to God at every single moment in some sort of action, in some sort of mitzvah. And that would be the action of displaying the love. We're talking about the love between the Jew and God. But the question is, I mean, this is very nice and it's very rosy and beautiful. We're close with God, regardless of background, regardless of our upbringing. It's very beautiful. It is. It brings out the idea of the unity of the Jewish people, and that essentially we are all the same. We all have the same Father in heaven, regardless of what we look like and what our history is, our personal history. But how realistically, how do we make that happen? And that's what we're going to talk about today. How is it realistic that a person can tap in to this hidden love and actually bring that love so close to the surface, or even to the surface, that it actually inspires and motivates an individual to actually want to do something about this passionate love that he or she has to their Father in heaven, to the Almighty, to Hashem. And that brings us then to another central theme of Tanya, which is, think about it. Everything the Alter Rebbe teaches in Tanya, and the fundamentals of a Hasidic way of life, which essentially is a Jewish way of life, is it should be approached intellectually first. Before I do anything, I need to think about it. I need to try to understand what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, what it's for, how it's going to help me now, how it's going to help me in the future, in the short term, in the long term. Is this something that's really necessary? Is this something that's really beneficial? And really, that thought process should be about pretty much everything that we do every single day. And that itself is a monumental task. It's a monumental task because most things we do out of routine. We don't even think about it. We just get it done. And perhaps that is one of the problems that we have in our lives today, certainly these days. I mean, this is something that's true perhaps throughout history, where people kind of got into routine and missed out, therefore, on so much of what life really has to offer, because we just stopped thinking about really of the meaning and the purpose and the beauty of every moment that we're alive and what we're doing. But certainly from a spiritual perspective, the things that we do should be thought about. And the more we think about things, the more we understand what's happening, what's transpiring, the better we can get in touch with our own reality, the better we can get in touch with the thing that we're doing, and the better we can understand the importance of what we're doing. And therefore, if I feel what I'm doing is important, I will be that much more into what I'm doing, excited about what I'm doing. And this is what the Alter Rebbe then says. The concept, the idea of the Ava Mesuteris, the hidden love, the Alter Rebbe says, most people don't even know they have it. Even if we know we have it, we don't feel it. But there is this one time where it comes to the forefront. And we gave an example of this last week, where a person, even if they're not observant, even if they're not very religious, even if they don't have a strong fundamental background in Judaism and in Jewish education, but if you attack their Jewish identity, if you question their Judaism, or if you attack them, the Jewish people, so to speak, then that person, who might even be an atheist, who might even question and ridicule the idea of faith in God and the idea of religion and the idea of Torah and mitzvahs, that same individual will stand up, will get upset, will defend, even to the point of self-sacrifice. And we've seen this in reality throughout our history, where people with very little Jewish education, with very little Jewish background, even people who are quote unquote sinners, people who are less than what they really should have been or what they could have been, even such people, when their identity as a Jew was threatened, they stood up like heroes and were willing even to sacrifice their life just not to change their faith, not to utter the words, "I renounce my Judaism." And the Alter Rebbe says this is proof that within that individual, even if the way this person has lived their entire life, even if everything this person has said up to this point and the way they've lived has been the opposite of what they're about to do, but when their Jewish identity is questioned, then it will be unequivocal. They will even sacrifice their life to make a point that I'm a Jew. Where does that come from? The Alter Rebbe says it comes from the fact that they have a hidden love to Hashem. They're connected with God. They can't renounce their connection to God. It's impossible. Renouncing their connection to God would be just like suicide. It would be disconnecting from life. And so the spiritual, the real spiritual connection becomes more important to that person than their actual physical life at that moment in time. And that's when the person is even ready to give up their life, just not to renounce their faith in God. That's what happens at that time. And the Alter Rebbe then says that what every person can do at every moment in time, not just if they're threatened or when they're threatened, but at every moment in time, can tap into this hidden love and use it as a springboard to make them want to do every positive commandment, to do every mitzvah as best as they can, and use every opportunity for a mitzvah. And then in the negative sense, to stay away from anything the Torah says not to do. In other words, to fulfill all of the negative commandments, which the Torah says not to do, equally with the same passion. So essentially, the Alter Rebbe here addresses that which many people are, find difficulty with, which is the concept of constant mitzvahs. There's constantly something to do in Judaism. There's always a mitzvah. There's always a precept, always a commandment. I have to do whatever I'm doing, it has to be in this way or in that way, not in that way, not in the other way. Very, very, very specific kind of lifestyle. And that can become difficult, even for those of us who have a Jewish background, even those of us who grew up with it and have studied it and know this from childhood. It's difficult It's difficult for two reasons, I would say. First of all, for those of us who grew up with it, it becomes routine, and we stop thinking about the importance of what we're doing, and therefore the meaning of it gets lost. So it's important to always remember and think about what we're doing. Otherwise, routine just takes away the human element of it and the experience. The other reason why it's so important is for those of us who have this background, or for those of us who don't have that background, it's important because tapping into this hidden love, to this connection that we have to God, this natural connection that we have to God, gives us the ability to do the mitzvahs, to do the things that we should be doing, and to not do the things that we shouldn't be doing at every moment and at every time with the same passion, with a passion that we have, using in a metaphor, the passion that a parent has to the child in the moment where he expresses or she expresses the love to her child and wants to do something about that love, and wants to really show that love, to take that, kind of bottle it and use it, not just sometimes when we feel a strong passion, but use it all the time. Imagine living like that. I mean, there are people, and we probably all know people like that, who are what we call high on life, literally, that are just literally, they're living every moment, you can say, to the fullest. They're just constantly excited and happy and bubbling over and seeing the positive and seeing the good in every single experience and every single moment. Sometimes for those of us who are, normal, it becomes too much. It's like, whoa, back off, slow down, just take it easy. But the truth is, it's a wonderful kind of life for a person who can live like that and really, take in the experience of every single moment. It's a beautiful, powerful thing. The question is, how do all of us normal people do that? And this is what the Alter Rebbe says. And that's what we'll discuss today. How is that possible? So what I'm going to do is, this is kind of a long topic, and it's going to be difficult to go into it quickly and cover it quickly. So what I'm going to do, I think, is we're going to describe it in a nutshell and explain it briefly, the whole topic, and then we're kind of going to back up a little and go then into the details of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. In a nutshell, the Alter Rebbe answers this question: how can a person truly experience the godly soul, truly experience the hidden love that they have for God at every single moment, and use that as a springboard, use it as a motivation to always do the right thing with a passion and with an excitement, and never do the wrong thing with the same passion and excitement, knowing that I'm staying away from something that's bad for me, that's wrong, that's not good? How can we live like that? So the Alter Rebbe says, again, intellectually, think about it. Think about what's happening when you do a mitzvah. What happens? What happens when we don't do a mitzvah, when we do the opposite of a mitzvah, when we do something negative, when we do something that we shouldn't do? What happens at that moment in time? What's the science of a mitzvah? What's the science of the opposite of a mitzvah? What's actually happening? And regardless of what mitzvah it is, it really makes no difference at all. You pick any of the 613 commandments, the 248 positive commandments that we have, or the 365 negative commandments that we have. Any of those, they're all equal. They all come from the same God, and God cares about every single one of those commandments in the same way. So you pick any mitzvah, your favorite one. Every single time we do it, are we passionate about it? Are we excited about it? And what happens when we're doing that mitzvah? What's going on? What's the background? What's going on behind the scenes? So the Alter Rebbe says, what's going on behind the scenes when a person does a positive commandment is they're creating their connection and a relationship to God, and building on their natural connection and making it even closer. They're bonding together. And the Alter Rebbe here borrows the term from Kabbalah, which is really the Aramaic translation of the word mitzvah. It's from the word tzavsa, which means to connect. Essentially, the proper translation for mitzvah is not commandment, which is translated popularly, although it does have the root word of commandment in it as well. Tziva means to command, But mitzvah is from the word tzavsa, which means to connect, which means that if the Torah, we have 613 mitzvot, these are not 613 commandments. Rather, these are 613 paths or ways in which to build on our relationship with God, to connect us with the Almighty, to connect us with infinity, to connect us with our true identity, which is infinite, that hidden love, that neshama, that soul, the spark that we have, that is godliness, that's inside of us. And every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect to Hashem. Now, when we think of a mitzvah in that context, it really changes the game completely. We're not talking about commandments. We're not talking about, hey, you have to do this. Hey, you better not do that. Because that's already childish. That sounds like grade school. We're being told what to do. We're being told what we better not do. We're being told that if you'll do X, Y, and Z, you'll get a treat. You'll be rewarded. And if you do A, B, and C, you might get punished. That's wrong. Stay away from it. It's not good. So the Alter Rebbe really here sheds a new kind of light on Judaism, which is a very, very powerful and inspiring and very, very motivating kind of light. Chassidus really is referred to as the Light of Torah. And the reason it's called the Light of Torah is because essentially it doesn't bring anything new to the Torah. All it does is it shines a light on the Torah. What happens when you shine a light on something? It doesn't change anything that you shone the light on. Everything that was there is still there. Whatever existed in the darkness still exists in the light. What happens when you shine a light? You simply reveal what was already there. Now I can see it. It was there before, I just couldn't see it. And so that's why Chassidus is called the light of Torah, because it illuminates, it brings out the true essence of what Torah really is. Without Hasidic philosophy, it's not seen. It's very hard to find that. But with a Hasidic kind of twist, you can then see what is really the soul of Torah. And this is what we're up to really, where the Alter Rebbe is telling us, think about what's happening when you do a mitzvah. And when we think about what's happening, when we realize the mitzvah is an opportunity to connect, the mitzvah is an opportunity to connect to myself more, because what is my true identity? I'm much more than skin and bones, right? I'm a soul, I'm a consciousness, I'm a spiritual being. That's who I am. And many people go to many psychologists and go to many gurus and try to figure out, who am I? What am I? The Alter Rebbe says, stop trying to figure yourself out. You are who you are. Just do the right thing, and you will discover yourself in the greatest, most powerful way that ever is possible. Just do the right thing and stay away from the wrong thing. That's who you are. It's a very, very powerful thought. And when we begin to think, to live that way, when we think about it, and when we begin to live that way, even if it's slowly, drop by drop, one action at a time, we really, really begin to discover ourselves in new, powerful ways. So this is the nutshell, in the short, the answer to the question. How can we bring this hidden love to the forefront in a way in which we can access it at every single moment? The answer is think about what we're doing, and you will realize that every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect to God. How would you waste that opportunity? How can you squander it? It would be equal to a parent having a very powerful and passionate relationship with their child, which we can assume every parent does. Some more revealed than others, perhaps, but every parent has a powerful connection and relationship and passion to their child and a love to their child. When a parent has an opportunity to show that love to the child, to show the attention, to give the child the time and the attention and the one-on-one that the child needs so much and wants so much from the parent, and the parent simply goes like this. What happens in that moment? What happens in that moment is something very, very terrible. As hopefully we all know, we don't do it, but we know it. We know that we're ignoring our child in the most rude kind of way, because we wouldn't do what I just showed you. We wouldn't do that in a business meeting. And if we would, we know what would happen. We'd probably get fired. or would take a pay cut, or there'd be some sort of reprimand. And if not, then we'd get some sort of strange looks. It's just not a way to behave. But how many times do we do that to our children? And is it right? It's not right. Of course, it's not right. There isn't a parent that would say it's the right thing to do. Every parent would agree that's the wrong thing to do. Yet we do it so much. Why? Because we don't think about what we're doing. We don't realize that what we're doing when we shift our attention away to our children, whether it's because of a device, which these days, mostly it's because of our personal handheld devices that we're so addicted to. But in general, it could be anything. It could be our child comes to us, we're watching the football game, and a child needs something or wants something, and we're like, sorry, I'm busy, I'm watching football. Or whatever it is that I might be busy with, reading the paper, or even studying Torah. There's a very interesting, and we'll just say it quickly, very beautiful story, actually from the author of the Alter Rebbe, the author of the book of Tanya, who, I believe it was his son once. His son was studying Torah late at night, and when he would study, he would get very, very deeply involved in his studies, and he would completely forget about his surroundings. He was completely unaware of where he was physically, and he didn't hear or feel or see what was going on around him. And his child, actually, in the other room, was crying in the middle of the night, and his father didn't hear him. And apparently the mother was not available, and the child cried and cried. The Alter Rebbe, the grandfather of the child, was also in another room, who was also busy studying Torah late at night, but he heard the child, and he went and he calmed the child and put the child back to sleep. And then he went to his son, and he told his son, how is it that you, during your Torah study, couldn't hear the cry of a Jewish child? And essentially, the point was, yes, you're studying Torah. You're busy with something very, very important. It's not the football game. You're not addicted to Facebook. You're studying Torah. You're involved in godliness and spirituality. You're spending your night not sleeping, but studying Torah. You're doing something really, really important. Yet, one can never be so preoccupied with themselves, even if it's with something that's holy, even if it's with something that's a mitzvah, and use that to ignore the needs of another individual. That's a very, very powerful statement. Very powerful statement. A very powerful and fundamental lesson in education and raising our children, and in friendship in general, but certainly in raising our children. So getting back to our topic, the Alter Rebbe says, you have an opportunity to connect. What parent, if we would truly think about it and understand that when our children need us, and need in the terms of attention is not just I want to talk to it's every time the child wants or has something to say to a parent, it's a need, because the child needs attention from their parent all the time. And if we look away, or if we postpone it for a good enough reason, we're simply throwing out golden opportunities to build on the natural relationship that we already have to our children, the love that we already have to our children. Remember, we're parents. We're healthy parents. Our children are healthy children. We're talking about emotional health. We're deeply in love with each other. Of course we are. And deeply passionate about our relationship as parent and child. Yet, sometimes when there's an opportunity to connect, we simply throw it out. And if we would think about what we're doing, we would stop throwing out those opportunities and start grabbing them at every single moment that we can, because every single time we have that opportunity, what happens is the relationship grows even more and more and more. And at every moment that you think, you know what, I can't get any closer, our relationship can't get any stronger, we are at the peak of our love, of our commitment to each other, of our relationship with each other. But every time we do something for each other, the relationship grows yet even more and more, because love essentially is infinite in potential. And as much as we respect and love each other and care for each other, we can always love and care for each other more and more and more infinitely. So a relationship and again, we're using parent-child relationship, but this does apply to every kind of relationship, certainly to a spouse relationship, but even to simple relationships, even to friends, to neighbors, to acquaintances, to coworkers. Any relationship is like a fire. It needs to be fed constantly. If you don't feed it, it will slowly die down. In the beginning, perhaps you won't see. In the beginning, it's going great, it's going good. Oh, you see, I don't need to feed the fire, it's doing well. And give it a couple of minutes, and it starts to die down. And if you don't feed it quickly, poof, it's gone. It may stay warm for a little while, a couple of hours. Otherwise, then after that, it's gone. Every relationship is like that. Every relationship has to be nurtured and fed and maintained constantly, especially, interestingly, but especially the relationships that are natural and the relationships that are the most powerful. Those relationships need to be fed and maintained constantly. And if they're not, what happens is the relationship begins to wither and begins to die down. It'll always, of course, stay intact because it's a natural relationship, but the relationship needs to be fed. And so if we give up, if we squander opportunities to connect, what happens is then we start feeling numb in that relationship. We say, oh, okay, so I looked at my phone once, I looked at my phone again and again. No, it doesn't really matter. You see, my child still loves me. My child still respects me. I still love my child. We're still on great terms. So I ignored them a couple of times. So my child now thinks that Instagram or Snapchat or whatever it is, or TikTok is more important. I don't know how many parents are doing TikTok, but whatever it is that we're busy with, stock trading is more important than them. That is essentially the message we're sending. So essentially, it's an opportunity to connect. And if we are mindful and intentional and purposeful about that, then our relationship comes to a brand new place, a much more powerful and beautiful place. And the same, the Alter Rebbe says, should be applied to our relationship with God. Every mitzvah is an opportunity to connect to the Almighty, to connect to the infinite, essentially to connect to God, part of who is inside of us, that is part of me, that is the essence of me. When I run around trying to question, who am I, what am I, just trying to discover myself, trying to discover why I am, who I am, in a sense, it's a silly question. I am right here with me all the time. Why am I running around trying to ask other people who I am? Yet there are many people asking that very question and doing that very thing. You know why? Because we haven't taken the time to truly discover ourselves with ourselves. No one can discover me as good as me. Nobody can, because nobody is me besides for me. It's a silly conversation almost, but it's a very powerful one. Chassidus says, stop trying to discover who you are. Start doing and behaving like the person you want to be, and then you will become and discover that person. Essentially, we discover ourselves through our behavior. If I want to be a good person, but I don't feel like a good person for some reason. If I want to, let's say, I want to pray. I feel like, you know what, I can connect to God through prayer. But I just don't feel like praying for some reason. It just doesn't speak to me. Well, maybe I just simply haven't done it enough. I need to start doing it. Once I do it, I start to discover, wow, this is good. I need to step into the role, so to speak, as they say, look the part. If you look the part and you start playing the part, you become the part. They talk about actors many times. Really, really good actors, people that play, whether it's on stage or on screen, a big part of their success is their preparation, of course, beforehand, and they're practicing. But more than actual practicing, it is in their minds stepping into emotionally and intellectually, stepping into the role that they're going to play, simply becoming the character that they're going to play. And that's when an actor truly can express that on a stage or on screen, because they've become that person by practicing and living and doing what the character would do every single day and every single moment. So the Alter Rebbe says, if that's true on a stage, if that's true in fake life, in Hollywood or on Broadway, how much more should that be true in reality, in real life? If I want to be a good person, but I simply don't feel that goodness coming from me, What do I need to do? Do I need to be confused? Do I need to spend thousands of dollars in therapy and countless hours? There's a much simpler approach, the Alter Rebbe says. You already are good. You already are kind. You already have godliness within you. You already are connected to the infinite. You have that potential within you. Just start doing it. Just literally do it. Get up and do the mitzvah. Do the kind thing. Be helpful. Be that good person. Just put that smile on your face, and you'll see it's so much easier than you think. Just step into the role. So if we want to feel this connection, this love to God at every moment, what we need to do, simply do the mitzvah. Simply have that presence of mind, that intentionality at every moment. Of course, it starts with little by little, but having that intentional approach to things. I don't just do things out of routine. I don't just do things because this is what I do. This is what we do. This is what, many people have that approach. As Jews, what do? Oh, we celebrate Hanukkah. What do? Oh, we light a menorah, we eat latkes and donuts, and we play dreidel, and we do all these other Jewish things. Why? Well, that's what we do. It's the holiday of miracles. It's the festival of lights. What do you mean? This is what we do. But why? For what reason? For what purpose? What's the history of it? And what does it have to do with you today in 2020? When we approach things intellectually, when we approach things with more of a sense of purpose, it means a lot more to us in our lives. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. This is all still, I guess, in a nutshell. But let's just wrap up this nutshell so we can start getting to the meat of the topic, of the subject. Wrapping up this nutshell will be as follows. Understanding that a mitzvah is an opportunity to connect, and I always want to be close with God. Taking back a few steps, why is it that the person who is even an atheist, but if you challenge his Jewish identity, that same atheist will get up and defend his Jewish identity like no one else, and will even be ready to sacrifice his life just not to renounce his faith? But you're an atheist. What kind of faith? What are you talking about? The Alter Rebbe says that's the paradox. The person doesn't have the love, the connection to God. It's not at the surface. The person doesn't have this identity consciously. He's not aware of it. But when the individual, when it's pulled out of them, so to speak, by threatening them, that's when this hidden love isn't hidden anymore. It comes to the forefront. You're questioning our relationship? Don't you ever question our relationship. It's like, again, to use a metaphor, and this is the best way to understand the topic. If you have a parent and a child who, God forbid, have fallen out of a relationship, or have had a very bad relationship, have had a very bad argument, sometimes perhaps even have disowned each other. I don't want to be your parent. I don't want to be your child. Sometimes it gets that bad, unfortunately. But even in such situations, the reality is that parent and child never stop being parent and child. That's part of the beauty of that relationship, even if it falls to pieces. The parent is still a parent, and the child is still a child, biologically. And that means that there is still a powerful love and still a powerful connection between these two individuals, parent and child. Many times what we see is in broken relationships, in broken homes, where parents are at odds with their children, and there's a very, very difficult relationship, and there's a lot of animosity. You try to step into that relationship, whether you're acquainted with these individuals or not, and say the words, "You are not this child's parent." That will trigger, I'll bet, that will trigger a very, very negative reaction from the parent. Who are you to say that? How can you say that? That's still my child. That's most likely the reaction that you will get, perhaps a lot more passionately and a lot more negatively. In other words, I'm broken about the fact that my relationship is broken with my child. That's the pain. The pain isn't that the relationship broke. The pain is that I want the relationship and it's not there. And when someone points out that the relationship is missing and that now I'm no longer a parent to that child, that's when all of a sudden my full parenting instincts come to the surface, and the passion that I actually have for my child that perhaps haven't been seen or visible, or that I myself haven't even felt for many years, perhaps. All of a sudden, all of that comes to the surface and you can see it. Why is it? Because you've threatened the core of that relationship. And so it comes to the surface and it defends itself. That's what we call defense mechanism. So the Alter Rebbe says this is the same with the Jew and God. Threaten that atheist who has denied God for all of that person's life. Threaten the atheist. Threaten the atheist's Jewish identity, and all of a sudden the atheist becomes a big believer. From where? Well, what you've done is the defense mechanism, the Jewish identity, that hidden love has come to the surface. So the Alter Rebbe says that's what we can do to ourselves at every single moment. We can understand that if we squander an opportunity to connect, if we squander, we give up on a mitzvah, we give up on an opportunity to do a mitzvah, is giving up on an opportunity to connect to God, is essentially like disconnecting from God. And if we think about it, it's like saying, I renounce my God, I renounce my faith, I renounce my Judaism. Because what's happening in that moment where I'm giving up the opportunity for the mitzvah, is I'm saying, I don't care about you, which are the worst, most damaging words that we can tell someone that we're in a relationship with. I don't care about you? What do you mean? We're close. The first thing we do is care about each other. That's the first thing. And if I say I don't care about you, then our relationship is gone. There's nothing to talk about. We never say those words to people, but very often, unfortunately, we act, we behave. Our behavior is one which says and screams a lot louder than words, I don't care about you. Something else is much more important than you right now. We're in a relationship. The most important thing should be the relationship with the other individual, nothing else. And when there's two things and I have to choose, something and relationship, it's always relationship, always. So when it comes to doing a mitzvah, if we just see that, if I do the mitzvah, I'm connecting with God. If I don't do the mitzvah, I give up on it. What I'm doing is I'm prioritizing something else. If I prioritize something else over the relationship, then the whole relationship is in question. My whole identity as a Jew is in question. My relationship with God is in question. Do I even have a Jewish soul? Comes into question. Obviously, this is an intellectual perspective. We're talking about perspective here. The reality is, the Alter Rebbe says, which we'll get to, perhaps not today, but in coming future lessons, the reality is that when a person gives up on a mitzvah, the person is disconnecting from God in that moment. Disconnecting from God in that moment, yes, only in that moment. The person is severing the relationship, ignoring. It's like when our child needs us and we're on our phone. That's what we're doing to God. And although many of us think this is not such a bad thing to do, let me guarantee you, and I'll put money down on it, that every single time we do that to our children, and every time we do that to our kids, I would say, yes, every single time we are hurting the relationship in small ways, but we're hurting the relationship. But we need to be aware of it. And the more we're aware of it, the more we have the strength to come home and take this device, if that's what we're talking about now, put it down and ignore it for a couple hours and prioritize our children, prioritize the people important to us. And the same thing the Alter Rebbe says is in Judaism. Approach your day, the Alter Rebbe says. We should approach our day with a perspective that my relationship with God is the most important thing. Doing a mitzvah is the most important thing, because every time I have an opportunity to do the mitzvah, that's my connection to God. Every time I give up on a mitzvah, or I do the opposite of a mitzvah, which those two, I guess, essentially are the same thing, I'm disconnecting from God. Disconnecting from God is just like renouncing my faith. It's just like the atheist who would say, yeah, I don't believe in God, and yeah, I don't mind, I don't care, I'll renounce my faith. The Alter Rebbe says, essentially, that doesn't exist. If one's faith is truly challenged, the Alter Rebbe says, every Jew will gladly give up their life before they renounce their faith. Gladly. And it's happened in our history. We know that it's happened in our history. Unfortunately, too many times. Too many times. The question is, and this is where we're getting to the next part of the topic, the question is, how do we do that? How can we truly bring this perspective to the surface where we have this approach to life, where we have this perspective that we are in a relationship with God, and that every single behavior matters to that relationship, and that every time I do something good, I get closer and the relationship blossoms and becomes more powerful and stronger. I get more in touch with myself, which myself, my true essence, is godliness and is part of God. And on the contrary, if I do something negative, if I do something bad, I'm distancing myself from God and I'm severing the relationship and hurting the relationship. Intellectually, it's something we can understand, but how can we get to truly feel that? How can we get to truly experience that? And for this, we need to spend some time. We need to spend some time and learn some topics, learn some fundamental ideas, and get acquainted with some Hasidic philosophies, some Hasidic, Kabbalistic, I would say truly, ideas, which will perhaps deviate a little bit from this topic. But I guarantee you we will come back. Probably not this week, but we will definitely come back to it in coming weeks. So before we jump into it, the Tanya is a very, very, it's a small book, essentially. It's really just 53 chapters. It's not very big at all, but it is very deep and rich in content. And it really cannot be read. It has to be studied and learned and reread and restudied and learned with commentaries and perhaps even with a teacher to truly, truly understand it. I mean, those of us who have gone to yeshiva know, I've experienced that, had the privilege actually of experiencing that myself, of studying Tanya for many years, starting as a young teenager even, and studying it over a long period of time. And even up to this point, and even those people who are much older than me would attest to the fact that learning Tanya and continuing to learn Tanya the entire life, constantly learning and appreciating it more and more and understanding more levels and layers of the meaning and the content, really, and the richness of the depth of the meaning of Tanya. So there's a lot. What I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of information here, and it's difficult to grasp sometimes at the first time that we learn it, but we're definitely going to attempt to be able to make it as understandable and basic as possible. But even at a basic level, it's still very, very, it's new, it's deep, and but it's interesting, it's philosophical, it's pleasant to the intellectual mind. So I'm sure we're all going to enjoy this. So let's jump into it. The Alter Rebbe says, to understand all of this and understand how to make this reality close to us on a regular basis, we need to understand the godly reality a little bit more. We need to bring God closer to us intellectually, which really is the only way to truly get close and to godliness, is in an intellectual way. And jumping a little bit ahead, this is why Torah study is the greatest closeness, which the Alter Rebbe actually calls unity, not closeness, unity with God, because Torah is God's intellect. Torah are the ideas that God has. It's God's will, God's desire, God's intellect. And when I study God's intellect, what happens is that those intellectual ideas and concepts, they become one with my intellect, with my brain, with the very fabric and fiber of my intellect, the flesh almost, not almost, but actually the flesh of my brain. The unity there is very, very powerful because I'm connecting with my intellect, is connecting with God's intellect. And essentially those two become one. And if we look at the structure of the human being, what is the highest level of a human being's structure? It is the intellect of the human being, right? Within the structure of our body, the intellect is the highest point, the hierarchy of actually the physics of our body. When we stand up, the intellect is at the very, very top, even at the top of the head, that is. And is certainly conceptually, Intellect is the most powerful, of course. The brain is the center and the computer system, if you will, of the body and of the human being in general. The intellect and the brain is really the system in which we perceive everything, where we feel everything, where our character is, where our emotions are, even though emotions really are more heart and blood oriented, really, because emotions are passionate, but still they're processed through the mind. So the brain is really the central essence of the physical person, is really the brain. It's the intellect. That's where everything takes place, is in the mind, everything. So when my mind, which is the essence really of who I am, physically who I am, is my brain connects with an idea which is outside of me, and that idea is understood by me through spending time on thinking about it and learning about it and processing it. And finally, after a long time, I've understood this concept and I've become one with this concept, literally, because this concept is now in me. I understand it and it's one with me. And many times a certain intellectual concept actually inspires a person to behave in a certain way. So it doesn't just remain an intellectual concept. It inspires and moves me to action, which means it doesn't just stay in the mind. It spreads to the rest of the body and even outside of the body, because I'm now behaving and acting in a certain specific way based on the idea that I've come to understand. So the intellectual ideas, concepts are very, very powerful because they literally become one with us. We become one with the ideas that we learn. The ideas that we learn well, that is, that we internalize and intellectualize. So when I study Torah, as an example, I become one with the author of the Torah. I become one with the ideas of the Torah, with the principles of the Torah, with the intellect of the Torah. And the author of the Torah is God, obviously. I'm saying obviously because that's what the Torah teaches us, that God has wrote the Torah and gave it to us through Moses. And this is, if that's a question, then obviously it's another topic, but it is still a great question and merits certainly a conversation and merits, there's lots of conversations, lots of topics on this, and perhaps we can discuss it at a time, and perhaps someone can bring up that question if they would like to talk about it. But for now, we have to accept this, that the Torah is given by God. And the Torah are godly ideas. So when we accept that as part of the Jewish faith, which it is, that the Torah is given by God, when I study the Torah, I don't just get close with God. I become one with God. It's oneness. Those ideas, those godly ideas, we become one with them. So getting back to our topic is, how are we to gain a closeness, to get a conscious closeness with God, with godliness, is to understand God intellectually as much as we can, to create an intellectual closeness, because really intellectual closeness is not just the most powerful way to connect to God. It truly is the only way to connect to God. And we talked before about mitzvahs, I know, and mitzvahs connect us to God. They do. And this is one of the things that we discuss, that the Alter Rebbe talks about in Tanya, is that there are two paths to connect to God. There are mitzvahs and there is Torah study. Torah study is one of the mitzvahs. It is a biblical, an actual commandment to study Torah. That is one of the mitzvahs. And so when I study Torah, I'm actually fulfilling one of the mitzvahs. But on a completely different level, Torah study on its own, not even being a mitzvah, but just the concept, the idea, the act actually of studying Torah is unto itself a path of connection to God, actually much more powerful than the mitzvah. Because the mitzvah, like in a relationship, makes us close with God. Just like when I have a relationship with a person, the more I serve that person, the more I help that person, the more I'm kind to that person, the more I show that I care that person with my actions and my behaviors, I show that I care about that person, the more our relationship grows and grows and becomes stronger and blossoms. so to also my relationship with God. The more mitzvahs that I do, them, and I do them even better and nicer, and I'm more excited and passionate about those mitzvahs, the closer my relationship is with God, and the more I have a relationship with God. Those are mitzvahs. But mitzvahs are closeness. It's very, very powerful. But we're talking about closeness. We're talking about two individuals that are separate, that are getting closer and closer and becoming more in love and more passionate with each other constantly, with every single action, with every single giving of attention and showing that you matter. And that can go on infinitely, your entire life, forever, and it can grow and grow and grow infinitely. There's no stop, there's no end to it, there's no limit to it. And so to also with the mitzvah, we can grow and grow and grow and get closer and closer and closer to God infinitely. And with God truly infinitely, because God really is infinite. With Torah study, however, it's not closeness. With Torah study, it is oneness. It's not two things that get really, really close and become even so close that they're even connected and stuck to each other. They're still two separate things, but they're stuck to each other. Oneness is when two things become one, actually one. There are no two separate things. You can't separate those two. They become one. They fuse together and become one entity. That's what happens during Torah study. We're talking, of course, about a high level of Torah study. We're talking about someone who truly, truly studies and completely puts themselves into the Torah study, completely puts themselves into it, and the Torah study transforms them, transforms their process of thinking, transforms their transforms them intellectually and also emotionally, and also on an action level, where they begin to behave based on the ideas that they've discovered and that they learned in the Torah. So that's a oneness. But essentially, the Alter Rebbe says that to get close to God is possible only intellectually. To get really close intellectually, it's the only way, and it's the most powerful way to get close to God intellectually. And so therefore, on this quest, if you will, on this quest to bring out the hidden love that we have to God, that exists within us constantly, to bring that to the forefront, to bring that to the surface, that we should be able to experience that closeness all the time, and therefore it will motivate us and inspire us to always do the right thing, to choose the mitzvah every single time over doing something else, and to choose to do the right thing, not the wrong thing, every single time, even if it's difficult, even if there are challenges, to be inspired and to feel that closeness and that relationship and that passion that truly exists, but to feel that passion at every single moment. And that passion is what moves us to always make the right choice. To feel that, there is a lot of preparation that has to be done. And mostly that preparation is intellectually, to understand godliness a little bit better. We're not talking now about doing mitzvahs specifically, or even about Torah study specifically. We're talking about learning certain characteristics about godliness, to understand God a little bit better. We're talking about definition, to understand the definition of godliness a little bit better, to understand God's relationship with the world and therefore with us a little bit better. And what happens then is we start to understand the science of the spirituality of Judaism. What's actually happening when we do a mitzvah? What's actually transpiring when we get close to God? Because we understand what God is. We understand the world around us and the relationship that the world has with God. And thereby, we're able to behave and bring that inspiration, the feeling, bring that closer to the surface, and therefore that would inspire our behavior. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of this topic of getting closeness, intellectually close to Hashem. But in the coming chapter, which, by the way, is chapter 21, if you want to read up in it and look for it, chapter 21 in the first section of Tanya, called Likutei Amarim. In that 21st chapter is what we're going to be discussing next week, is a little bit of what godliness is, and specifically how God created the world, what mechanisms God used to create the world, and therefore what is the relationship of the world with God. When we can have that understanding a little bit better, we can then understand how it is that we connect to God through the mitzvah, or God forbid, how we disconnect if there is the opposite of the mitzvah. So again, it's an intellectual exercise. It's a very, very powerful and beautiful and very eye-opening, actually, exercise. Very, very interesting, at least in my opinion. And we're going to explore this in more detail next week, God willing, Tuesday, right here, same place, same time, 8 p.m. I look forward to seeing you. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. Thank you for paying attention. If you have any questions on this topic or other Jewish topics even, feel free to message me or email me, rabbimendel@jewishfairlawn.org, or anywhere else that you can message or text or email or chat with someone. Hopefully I will be able to be available to you and discuss any topics that interest you. Again, thank you, and look forward to seeing you very soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a very, very, very happy Hanukkah.